Colorado's borders are almost a perfect rectangle. Congress literally drew it with a ruler. It might be the most geometrically boring state on the map, but those clean lines are hiding one of the most chaotic, violent, and bizarre histories of any state in America. A place where entire civilizations vanished, where soldiers massacred people flying American flags, where 11 children burned alive in a labor war, and where the Army's most toxic chemical weapon site is now a nature preserve full of bald eagles. This is the entire history of Colorado. If you enjoy videos like this, feel free to subscribe. The civilization that walked away. Before any of that chaos, something even stranger was happening here. For thousands of years, people thrived in Colorado's harshest terrain, not on the easy plains, not along gentle rivers, but inside cliff faces. The Ancestral Puebloans carved a civilization into sandstone alcoves at Mesa Verde, building rooms 6 by 8 feet and stacking multi-story structures with original timbers that are still visible more than 700 years later. More than 4,700 archaeological sites survive across the mesa. These were not crude shelters. They were planned communities, people who farmed, traded across vast distances, and engineered something remarkable in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on the continent. And then, around 1300 CE, they vanished. Not slowly, over generations. Rapidly. The dwellings were left intact, tools in place, as though everyone simply walked away one morning and never came back. Archaeologists still argue about the exact cause: drought, resource collapse, social conflict, or some combination of forces that finally broke what the land could sustain. No one knows for certain, but the pattern matters. People built something extraordinary in Colorado, and then Colorado pushed them out. They would not be the last. Empires on paper. After the Puebloans left, other nations moved through and dominated the region. Ute, Apache, Comanche, Arapaho, and Cheyenne were people who built lives around bison, trade, and seasonal movement across landscapes they understood intimately. The Ute controlled the mountain parks and high valleys of the western slope. The Comanche dominated the southern plains with mounted warfare that reshaped power across the entire Southwest. The Cheyenne and Arapaho ranged across the eastern grasslands, following the massive bison herds that provided food, shelter, tools, and trade goods. Colorado was not empty. It was full of people who had learned to live on the land's own terms, following the rhythms of migration and weather rather than fighting against them. But the land itself was being traded by people who had never seen it. Spain claimed it in the 1500s, drawing lines across maps from offices an ocean away. France claimed the eastern plains in 1682. Then the United States acquired the eastern half through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and the western half through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Entire civilizations were absorbed into foreign empires by strokes of ink, thousands of miles from the ground those lines were supposed to describe. For the people actually living there, nothing changed yet. The bison still moved, the seasons still turned, the paper claims seemed meaningless, but paper has a way of becoming real. And the moment something valuable was found in the dirt, those distant lines would collide with the people already standing on them. Gold and the overnight territory. For decades, Anglo-Americans mostly ignored Colorado. Zebulon Pike explored the region in 1806 and declared much of it unfit for settlement. The Santa Fe Trail brought some wagon traffic across the southeastern corner, but the land was considered too harsh, too remote, too dry for anything serious. Colorado was a place you crossed on the way to somewhere else. Then, in 1858, gold was discovered near present-day Denver. The effect was instantaneous. Tens of thousands of people flooded in within months, many carrying everything they owned in wagons painted with the words Pikes Peak or Bust. The Pikes Peak gold rush transformed Colorado from an afterthought into a frenzy, a place where a man with a pan and a mule could supposedly become rich by sundown. Congress carved the Colorado Territory out of 4 existing territories on February 28, 1861, the same month the Civil War started. Colorado went from wilderness to political entity practically overnight. The population exploded from almost nothing to nearly 40,000 by 1870. Colorado volunteers even fought for the Union, helping stop a Confederate advance at Glorieta Pass in New Mexico in 1862, tying the young territory's identity to the Northern cause before it even had proper roads. But the gold rush did not just bring prospectors, it brought a collision with the people already living there. And what happened next is the darkest chapter in Colorado's history. The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty had recognized roughly 44 million acres for the Cheyenne and Arapaho, an enormous swath of the Central Plains that included much of what would become eastern Colorado. But as miners and settlers flooded in, that territory was slashed by subsequent treaties and simple encroachment. Promises shrank. Tensions escalated. The people who had been guaranteed a homeland watched it dissolve around them. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led about 675 Colorado volunteers in a surprise attack on Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek. Black Kettle was flying both an American flag and a white flag of truce, signals that should have meant safety. The volunteers killed between 150 and 230 people, many of them women, children, and elders. Bodies were mutilated, trophies were taken. The attack was initially celebrated as a military victory in Denver, with soldiers parading through the streets to cheers. Later, federal inquiries called it what it was, a massacre, but the damage was done. Sand Creek sparked years of violent retaliation across the plains. By the late 1860s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho had been forced out of Colorado entirely, pushed onto reservations far from the land they had been promised. The site of the massacre was not formally protected as a National Historic Site until 2007, 143 years after the killing. The land was now open for what Colorado does best: extraction. The Centennial bet. After the Civil War, Colorado rebuilt its identity around pulling wealth out of the ground. Leadville silver. San Juan mining camps perched at elevations above 10,000 feet. Pueblo steel making fed by coal from the southern basins. Denver grew into the region's commercial hub, a supply town that skimmed a percentage off every ounce of ore that moved through the territory. Money flowed so fast that Leadville briefly became the second largest city in the state, with opera houses, saloons, and hotels that rivaled anything on the East Coast. And on August 1st, 1876, almost exactly 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, Colorado became the 38th state. Newspapers immediately branded it the Centennial State. The timing was deliberate and the branding was instant. But the extraction economy was a house of cards. Colorado's population surged from 40,000 to over 400,000 in just 20 years. And almost all of that growth was tethered to the price of metal set in markets an ocean away. When global silver prices collapsed in 1893, mining towns across the state cratered almost overnight. Communities that had sprung up around single veins simply disappeared. Opera houses went dark. Banks locked their doors. Streets that had been packed with miners and merchants emptied out so fast that some towns were abandoned within months, buildings still standing, goods still on shelves, as if the people had simply evaporated. Colorado had made its first modern bet, and it had lost. But the mining economy did not just collapse financially, it turned violent in a way that would shock the entire country. The death pit at Ludlow. The collapse of silver did not end extraction in Colorado, it just shifted the target. By the early 1900s, coal had replaced silver as the dominant industry, and the conditions in the coal fields were brutal. Miners lived in company towns, bought from company stores at inflated prices, and had no leverage against the operators who controlled every aspect of their lives. The companies owned the houses, the roads, even the schools. Leaving meant losing everything. In 1913, roughly 10,000 miners went on strike across southern Colorado. They moved their families out of company housing and into tent colonies scattered across the plains. Canvas cities filled with men, women, and children who had decided they would rather freeze in the open than continue living under the company's thumb. On April 20th, 1914, National Guard troops and company guards attacked the tent colony at Ludlow. They poured machine gun fire into the canvas. They set the tents ablaze. When the smoke cleared and the ashes cooled, rescuers found a pit dug beneath one of the tents, a shelter where families had tried to hide from the gunfire above. Inside that pit lay 11 children and 2 women, suffocated and burned. The discovery of the death pit horrified the nation. A 10-day guerrilla war erupted across the coal fields before federal troops finally intervened. Ludlow became a touchstone for labor rights in America, fueling later reforms on mine safety, child labor, and corporate accountability. But for Colorado, it was another chapter in the same story, an economy built on extraction and the human cost of keeping it running. When the ground itself blew away. With the mining economy scarred and the labor movement reshaping the state, Colorado turned to the one resource it had not yet gambled on: the land itself. The Homestead Act and its 1909 expansion brought waves of settlers who plowed up shortgrass prairie across the eastern plains and planted crops in semi-arid soil. For a while it worked. Rain was above average during those early years. Towns sprouted along rail lines, wheat fields stretched to the horizon. It looked like the plains had been tamed. Then the 1930s drought hit, and the bet collapsed in the most literal way possible. The plowed-up soil had nothing to hold it. No root systems, no prairie grass, nothing to keep the earth in place when the wind came. Enormous dust storms called black blizzards buried farms across southeastern Colorado. Walls of dirt rolled across the plains like slow-moving tsunamis, turning day into night and coating everything: houses, livestock, lungs, and fine brown powder. An estimated 1.2 billion tons of topsoil blew off 100 million acres, darkening skies as far as the East Coast. Baca, Prowers, Las Animas, and Kiowa counties were among the hardest hit in the entire country. Children walked to school with wet cloths tied over their faces. Cattle choked in the fields. Families who had bet everything on the land watched it literally blow away, with their fields and their futures carried east on the wind. Colorado had tried mining and it collapsed. It tried farming and the land itself rebelled. But what came next would transform the state in a way nobody predicted, because the federal government was about to place a bet of its own. World War II brought something Colorado had never had before: sustained federal investment that was not tied to pulling something out of the ground. Bases went up, defense contractors moved in, and most dramatically, the Army built the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, a sprawling facility of roughly 17,000 acres just north of Denver, where workers manufactured mustard gas, napalm, incendiary bombs, and other chemical weapons starting in 1942. The arsenal operated for decades, churning out some of the most toxic substances ever created on American soil. After the weapons programs wound down, what remained was one of the most contaminated sites in the country. The soil was laced with chemical agents, and the groundwater was poisoned. The arsenal was declared a Superfund site in the 1980s, a designation reserved for the worst environmental disasters in the nation. For years it sat there, fenced off, toxic, a dead zone surrounded by Denver's expanding suburbs. But then, the story flipped. A massive cleanup effort transformed the arsenal, and in 2004 it began reopening as the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. Today, visitors watch bison graze and bald eagles circle on the same ground where the Army once manufactured chemical weapons. It is one of the most surreal transformations in American history, and a microcosm of Colorado's larger story. Destruction, then reinvention. The same land repurposed for something no one could have imagined a generation earlier. The Front Range Machine. The defense economy did not leave after the war. It anchored, becoming an anchor. Colorado Springs got the Air Force Academy in 1958 and NORAD headquarters buried inside Cheyenne Mountain. Denver attracted aerospace contractors and federal research labs. Boulder got the University of Colorado and a growing cluster of scientific institutions. Each new installation pulled in more people. More people justified more investment. More investment created more jobs. More jobs attracted more people. The cycle fed itself, decade after decade. Colorado's population surged from 1.3 million in 1950 to over 5.7 million by 2020, with roughly 95% of that recent growth concentrated along the Front Range corridor, the narrow urban strip running from Fort Collins through Denver to Colorado Springs. The same geographic pattern that the gold rush established in the 1850s still holds today. The Front Range had the flat land, the infrastructure, the water diversions funneled through tunnels bored straight through the Continental Divide, and the critical mass that pulls everything toward it. In 1995, Denver International Airport opened, instantly becoming one of the largest and busiest airports in the country, another anchor pulling talent and capital into the corridor. Western Colorado remains spectacular, but sparse. A place people visit, not a place they stay. A young person growing up in Grand Junction or Durango who wanted a career in medicine, engineering, or tech had to leave. The jobs, the universities, the venture capital, all of it sat on the Front Range. The modern state crystallized around a single urban corridor, built on the bones of military bases and defense spending that replaced mining as the engine of growth. But Colorado was not done placing bets. The Green Bet. In 2012, Colorado voters approved Amendment 64 with about 55% of the vote, legalizing recreational cannabis for adults 21 and over. Possession became legal that December. The first recreational dispensaries opened their doors on January 1st, 2014, with lines stretching around the block. Colorado became a global test case, the first place to try regulated adult-use cannabis on this scale. Tourism spiked. Tax revenue poured into schools and public health programs. In its first year alone, recreational cannabis generated tens of millions in state revenue, money that funded school construction, substance abuse treatment, and public safety. Other states watched closely, studied Colorado's data, and then followed. Within a decade, recreational cannabis was legal in nearly half the country. Colorado had placed another bet on extraction, this time of a plant, and for now, it is paying off. Dispensaries line the same Front Range corridor that gold seekers built, their green crosses glowing in strip malls from Fort Collins to Pueblo. But anyone who knows Colorado's history has to ask the question, is this just another boom? The silver miners thought the veins would last forever. The homesteaders thought the rain would keep coming. Every generation in Colorado has believed that this time, the bet would hold. Pull back far enough, and the rectangle reappears. Those straight lines Congress drew with a ruler contain over 13,000 years of people arriving, building, extracting, and being forced to start over. Cliff dwellers vanished from the mesas. Indigenous nations were removed from the plains. Silver towns collapsed into ghost towns. Children died in a labor war fought over coal. Soil blew away in black blizzards. Chemical weapons were manufactured on the prairie and then replaced with wildlife. And now cannabis dispensaries sit along the same Front Range corridor that the gold rush built more than a century and a half ago. Colorado's motto is nil sine numine, nothing without providence. But looking at the full sweep, it feels less like providence and more like a pattern. Arrival, extraction, collapse, reinvention. Over and over, century after century, the same cycle playing out on the same land. The rectangle stays the same. What happens inside it never stops changing. If you enjoyed this, one of the recommended videos is on screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover. Thanks for watching.